Hi, so thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about how Uber built its developer platform and sort of where it started and some lessons we learned along the way. But first, a little bit about me. I built platforms for developers for almost a decade now. I originally started in the open source community on a PHP framework called Symfony, which I brought to Yahoo to rebuild properties like Yahoo Answers and Delicious. And so I've worked on the open source side. From there, I did a lot of consulting and started to work with enterprises through a company called AppDynamics, where I built enterprise software and helped build technical integrations community. And then most recently, I've joined Uber to help Uber build their developer platform. And so I've helped with the open source world and driving open source adoption and communities around there. I've also helped build enterprise integrations and technical communities, and now I'm working on building open platforms. And so today I'm going to primarily focus on Uber. So you probably know Uber by now. Push a button, get a ride. Doesn't really get much simpler. And so Uber's mission is really to make transportation as reliable as running water, everywhere and for everyone. And we've done that in more than six continents, in more than 73 countries, in more than 470 cities. By partnering with more than 1.5 million active drivers monthly that deliver on average 5 million trips per day. And last July, we hit our 2 billionth trip. And so to think about the scale, we've done this in just under 8 years, which is one of the fastest growing companies that's ever existed. And part of the way we've done this is by helping teams build moving experiences. And so this really leads me to my team's mission, which is to build an open platform for building moving experiences, which means really moving people and things. And so a lot of you probably know Uber Rides, but we actually offer many more services, like not only moving people, but things like food, or if you just want to courier a suit across the city to a tailor, many different services. And so we want to expose all of this functionality through our developer platform. And so that's what we've done. And so again, my team's motto is really build moving experiences. And the idea is to work with developers to forge partnerships and give them the tools necessary to make magic and to let builders build. And Uber has a cultural value, which is to let builders build, which means to just enable people with tools and to not block. And then moving experiences, getting people from A to B, but not just people, things as well. And so we want to give people features while they move, while they're in the ride. We want to expose functionality like on-demand delivery through Uber Rush. And we want to make your daily life easier by integrating with all the apps that you already use. And so this reflects another cultural value, which is to make magic. We want every experience to be magical. And I think if you've taken an Uber the first time you take it and you just push a button and a car shows up and takes you to your destination, it's quite moving. And so let's talk about the journey so far. Really, I think this reflects the motto, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And if you look at companies like Facebook, Apple, etc., they wouldn't be what they are without embracing an app ecosystem or an open developer ecosystem. And so that's really where we got started. And long before there was an open API that we publicly supported, the community started to reverse engineer it. And so where there's a will, there's a way. I think if developers want to build something, there's no stopping them. And so long before we had a public API, in 2013, developers started reverse engineering the communications between our mobile application and the server side to understand our private API. And so there was a definite need. And we wanted to capitalize on this need, but we also wanted to enable developers. And the easiest way to do this was to give them a deep link, to push a button and get a ride. And so the idea was that we wanted to enable this functionality in every application that existed. And so long before there was a REST API, we offered this deep link functionality so that you could open the Uber app with a deep link with the destination that's already set and a pickup location at your current location. And so this enabled a ton of different integrations. And we started to have Uber buttons in all the different apps that people start to use. So if you know City Mapper or Transit app, you'll see that Uber started to become an option in each one of these apps. We started to work with airlines like United and hotel chains like Hilton. And so that if you know that there's a need to go to the airport or you're at an airport and you want to go to your hotel, we wanted to make it as easy as possible. And so we started this with deep links. And deep links were just a really simple way for people to embed a button into their application and to be able to get a ride on demand. So in 2014, we released our first public API. And this is really a REST API that allowed you to do ride requests, go from A to B. And in 2015, our first partner started building experiences on top of Uber. And so we really wanted to create something that's unique, not just getting a ride from A to B, but how can you augment the experience and complement it with other functionality. And so today, leading global brands elevate their experiences with Uber. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we built each one of these APIs and the use case they solved. So, but first, like, what's an API? What does it mean to you? I think of it as an interface between two systems. I think if you're non-technical, it's just an integration between products. But ultimately, it's an experience created by people. And I think that in order to do this, you give builders the tools that they need to follow their inspiration to build something useful. And so oftentimes, this comes in many forms. And so when we built the open API, we really wanted to make it as easy as making an API call and getting a ride. And so if you make a single REST API call, you could get a ride in any application. And so we really wanted to make the things that are complex extremely simple. And so it really started with the ride request API. And so ride request is pretty straightforward, as everyone knows the Uber app functionality. The next thing that we saw was that developers wanted to not only be able to order rides, but to be able to integrate directly into the trip experience itself. When you understand when somebody has free time, I know that you have a flight scheduled at 6 p.m., you're probably going to need a ride, so I could schedule a ride for you. Once I'm in the ride, I know that where you're coming from and where you're going and how much free time you have. So there's an opportunity to capture a user's attention and to provide a custom experience that's curated around the details of their ride. And so we launched Trip Experiences, which allows you to directly integrate into the experience of the Uber trip. And then we have this notion of program teams and platform teams. And at Uber, we have many different program teams which basically build products. And so one of those products is deliveries, on-demand delivery. So you probably know this through Uber Eats, where you can get food delivered on demand. But imagine if you could do this for anything. If you just want to have somebody pick up something and drop it off across the city, you can now do that on demand. And if you think of many restaurants or tailors or lawyers who want to move paperwork, whatever it is, there's a large use case for being able to move things from A to B. And so we started to enable our internal teams to build functionality for not only drivers, but also for deliveries. And so today we have 4 developer products: the Ride Request API, the Trip Experiences API, the Drivers API, and our Deliveries API. And these all started from an original need. But a platform is not just a product. And one of the things we didn't want to do is just release an API and see what happens. Because in order for you to build something useful, you need to build an ecosystem. And so platforms are really ecosystems. And if you look at Facebook, I think is a great example where the way they competed with MySpace and Friendster and differentiated themselves very early on was allowing you to deeply integrate with the Facebook experience and take your Facebook context and apply it to third-party applications. And this is very true for Apple as well. Before iOS launched the App Store, it was carriers that controlled the apps that were available on your phone. And once you start to open this up to a larger community, people can build whatever applications they want, and you start to build this ecosystem of applications. And so we wanted to do this as well. And so building a platform that interacts with the real world adds a whole nother level of complexity, because all sorts of things can happen. Accidents happen, traffic delays happen, people just get lost. There's all sorts of things that you can't control when you're working with the physical world. And the reality is we only have 64 bits and 500 milliseconds to respond, so there's only so much we can do. And if you take a look at how Uber is actually built underneath, we have this microservice architecture that's more than 3,400 microservices. And so just getting a ride from A to B, there's more than 100 services that pertain to the core trip flow. But when you want to do an integration, you don't want to have to understand all of this. You want it to be as simple as possible. And so what we really started to do was make it easy for people to integrate by not having to understand our microservices architecture, but just be able to make a single API call and get a ride. And so we tried to make the complex simple through Ride Request API. And so Ride Request, again, it's pretty straightforward. Push a button, get a ride, go from A to B. Doesn't really get easier. And so oftentimes you start to understand that there's an intent to ride. So we wanted to expose different functionality. Like I want to be able to have ride reminders to give you a push notification for when you might need a ride. Maybe I integrate directly with your calendar and I want to be able to know, hey, you have an appointment across town in an hour, you should leave for this in 30 minutes and we'll have a ride waiting for you. And you start to understand the intent to ride. And so we started to expose different endpoints for each one of these. One, we understand that every city is unique, not only in the traffic patterns and how transportation works in a city, but also the products that work well in a city. And so we started to release the products endpoint so you could see what's actually available in an individual city. And so with our products endpoint, you can see, okay, is Uber Eats available? Is Uber Rush available? Is Uber Rides available? And then is it Uber Pop or is it Uber X? Do you have the concept of Uber Pool or is it only black cars? And so we started to be able to add different ride options. And then we started to release the estimates price endpoint and the estimates time endpoint. And so this was how long does it take to get a ride and how much is that ride going to cost me? And so this enabled a whole nother level of integrations where you could start to be able to integrate with things like City Mapper and to offer yourself as a transportation option. And then we wanted to make ride requests as easy as possible to integrate, not just through deep links, but not just through a REST API. Maybe you want to drop in our iOS or Android SDK and just embed a widget and have the entire Uber experience inside of your application. Or maybe you just want to drop in a button. And then I think there's the standard ride details. So when you're on currently a ride, where are you coming from? Where are you going? How long do you have? And what is the context of the ride? And then being able to use your identity as reputation and be able to log into services with Uber. And so this was the first set of APIs we released publicly. And so we started to see integrations like City Mapper that use the products endpoint just to discover what products are available at a given latitude and longitude. And then the estimates price endpoint to figure out, okay, how much is this ride going to get from A to B? And then finally a time endpoint where you can see, okay, how long is it actually going to take for the ride to show up? And so we started to see all sorts of interesting integrations across our ecosystem. And so we didn't want to actually have to require you to have the Uber app installed, but if you did have the Uber app installed, we wanted to make it easy to just deep link it directly into the application with the destination predetermined. And so that's what we have now, where you can see in City Mapper, you can click a button and go directly into the Uber app. But even if you didn't have the Uber app installed, you could embed a widget and the entire Uber experience would be enabled through your application without having Uber available on your phone. And so this enabled a whole host of new integrations. And so if you think about sort of the rise of bots and the conversational interfaces, now you can ask Google for a ride or Amazon's Alexa or even SoundCloud. And so we started to integrate with all of these assistants and all of these conversational interfaces and platforms to make it as easy as possible for Uber to get a ride. And this was all powered by our ride request API. But it's more than just enabling third parties. Some of our top tier partners like Facebook and Google, you can actually understand the entire experience without having the Uber app installed. And so this is actually Google Maps. And if you're in Google Maps, you can now directly use Uber by just searching for a location and then having the entire Uber experience directly inside of Google Maps. So you don't even have to have Uber installed. And so we're starting to enable these sort of integrations. The same with Facebook Messenger. If you're in a conversation with somebody and you say, hey, let's meet here at this time, you can just have a Uber ordered for you directly. And so you start to see this evolution of how do you bring Uber to all these different places and what are the APIs that are required to make it happen. When we first started, we just thought, okay, if we give people a REST API, that would be enough. And then what we realized is later, no, that's not nearly enough. People actually want to understand the different states of the rides. And so we started to add webhooks. Webhooks basically allow applications to be reactive. They allow you to have a two-way communication. And so if you think about the different states of a ride, an Uber ride is really just a state machine. And so you just progress through a series of states. And for each one of these states, we have a webhook that will notify your application that, okay, we're processing your request and we're finding a driver to assign to you. The driver will be here in a certain time, so that request has been accepted. And once the driver gets close to you, we'll send you a notification that, hey, the car is arriving now. And then once you get in the car, you start the trip, and the trip becomes in progress. And then once you arrive at your destination, you've completed the trip. But there's a lot of different things that can happen. Again, when you interact with the real world, there's a whole nother level of complexity just because riders can cancel. Actually, I wasn't ready for a ride. So how do I enable that to happen really quickly so you're not wasting drivers' times? The same for drivers. Actually, hey, I just got in an accident or I just hit a bunch of traffic. It's going to take me a lot longer. So now I need to cancel. How do I enable you? If you have an integration, you need to be able to monitor the state. It's not just enough to make the API call and expect that a ride will happen. In most cases, that is what happens. happens. You make an API call and you get a ride, but sometimes there's error conditions. And so we started to add webhooks to enable this functionality. And through webhooks, we basically enable you to get notified for each one of these states so you can start to build custom experiences around the Uber trip. And so we started to productize this, and we call this trip experiences today. And trip experiences really allows you to use webhooks to integrate directly into the Uber journey. And so while you're on your way from A to B, you'll get webhook notifications. So for every user that's signed into your application and approved the all trip scope, they'll get notified whenever you take an Uber trip. And so they can start to do push notifications, or they can start to create custom experiences around that trip. When I know where you're coming from and where you're going, I can start to do some interesting stuff. And so like I said, we hit our 2 billionth trip last July, and actually we've far surpassed that today. And the average trip in the US is 20 minutes. And so if you think about that, that's 40 billion minutes of free time of users' attention that they can capture. And so once you're able to provide really cool experiences by understanding where they're coming from, where they're going, and where they have free time, you can build some interesting stuff. And so we start to try to expose the Uber context to third parties. And so if you can think about how this would work at like a hotel, if I have a reservation at a hotel, they can understand, hey, I've actually arrived at the airport and I'm 10 minutes away from the hotel, so now I can be greeted at the entrance. Or if you have an airline, I know that I need to be here at a certain time, so here's your flight details, here's everything you need to know while you're on the way to the airport. If there's delays, you can be notified in real time. And so we wanted to start to expose this, and the way we did that was through webhooks. And the Trip Experiences API really tells you when a user is going to have free time. Do they have a trip scheduled in the future? If so, at what time? How much free time do they have? So what's the length of the journey? And where you're coming from and where you're going. And so we started to build some interesting integrations. And at first, we didn't launch with a bunch of partners. Usually the way people build platforms is you try the concept with some top tier partners, you figure out like what works and what doesn't, and then you release a live integration. And so over time, what we really wanted to do is we just release this and say, here are some use cases we can imagine. Now you guys go build them and let's see what we come up with. And so when we started, we really seeded this idea of, if I'm on my way home, I want to have my Nest, pre-condition my house for me. Or if I'm on my way leaving the house, I want to turn off the lights. And so there's all sorts of different things that you can start to do. But one of the more interesting ones, and one of the ones I found useful, was auto radio. And so auto radio on its own is a podcasting application that allows you to have curated content. And you can start to think about how this would integrate with Uber. When you're off the trip experience, you have regular curated content. Maybe you have morning news update that you like, and in the evening you listen to entertainment. But once you're on trip, you can start to use the trip context to enable a custom experience and a third-party application. And so auto radio integrates with Uber, and they integrate using trip experiences to provide a custom podcast based on the length of your ride. And so once you're on trip, you'll get this trip tray that allows you to see, without having to reference the Uber app, how far am I away from my destination? And then how long is it going to take me to get there? And so they can start to craft custom content based on your location, based on where you're coming from, and based on the length of your ride. And so this is one of the easiest ways to get a custom experience. And so our mission on the developer platform is twofold. Both internally, we want to empower program teams to launch APIs, and externally, we want developers to be successful adopting these APIs. And so right now, Uber is more than, I think, 14,000 people globally, and we're organized as program teams and platform teams. And the easiest way to think about this is that program teams build products on top of technology platforms. And so we wanted to enable every team to build APIs in a quality way, in a standardized and consistent way. And so that's what we started to do. In the same way, we wanted an open ecosystem so that any developer could go to developer.uber.com, create an application, and launch it without having to interact with the Uber team. We wanted Uber internal teams to be able to launch new APIs on top of us with just following our platform. And so we started to do that. And so we have many languages in use at Uber. We're a polyglot organization. We primarily use Go, Java, Node, and Python in production. And so we have a really diverse set of teams. Again, 14,000 full-time employees globally. And they use a whole host of technologies. And the problem is when you give people a lot of autonomy and freedom, part of the Uber's ability to scale is by giving teams autonomy and being able to have them pick their tool set. And that works for quite a long time until you hit a certain scale. And then you have, at some point, 3,400 microservices, and they're named crazy things, and they're built in various languages that not everyone understands. And so you need to start to standardize. And so what we started to do was enable internal teams to use our developer platform to just expose APIs. And so the first team that was really interested in adopting this was the Uber Rush team. And so the Uber Rush team does on-demand deliveries. And if you can think about this as just moving things from A to B across any city. And I think most teams most people know Uber Eats. I think Uber Eats is available here in Warsaw. But we wanted to expose that via third parties, because moving people is one thing, but when you can move a thing from A to B, you open up a whole nother level of use cases. And so this is an independent program team. We didn't work directly with them. We wanted to just give them a technology platform that they could build on top of to release a quality API. And a quality API is more than just a REST interface to some functionality. It's an entire ecosystem. It's SDKs, sample apps, tutorials, support community, partner engineering, and developer advocacy. And so over time, we really wanted to just say, okay, if you can build on top of our platform, you don't need to really interact with us. You can follow the standard recipe, and you will have a production-grade API. And so we started to enable teams to do that via self-service. And so the deliveries API is really straightforward. It's just like the ride request API. I can get a quote for how much is this going to cost me to go from A to B. And then I can make a request for the delivery. And once the delivery is in progress, I can just check the status of the delivery and say, okay, where is it in the city? How far is it from its destination? And so what we realized is there was a ton of food delivery companies that wanted to use this to replace their delivery teams. And so no longer on popular days did you have to hire 10 additional drivers. You could just outsource to Uber, and now Uber could be your delivery workforce. And so we started to do this with a lot of food delivery companies, but also interesting use cases for tailors, document delivery, etc. And the next team was the drivers team. So we actually have many different teams working on the driver ecosystem. So tools that make it easy to use your driver identity as a reputation platform, make it easy to see all the different trips you took and how much you earned on each trip, as well as how much were you driving and how much can you deduct off of your taxes. And so there's all these sorts of tools that we wanted to empower. And so we recently launched an integration with Intuit and H&R Block to make it easy for drivers to be able to do their taxes and automatically deduct all the mileage they drove in a programmatic way. So they didn't have to do these calculations at the end of the year. And so we built tools for like Stride and many others that allow you to get same-day payments. And all of this is powered via this partners API. And so again, it allows you to use your identity as a reputation platform through our partners me endpoint. It allows you to pull your history of trips. And then finally, it allows you to pull the payments. How much did you make on each trip? And then how much is actually tax deductible? And so this enabled a whole nother level of integrations as well. And so not only did we want to empower these internal teams to build in a self-service way, we also want to enable external teams to build on top of these products. And so we learned a few lessons about building platforms for developers, what works and what doesn't. And so the first thing is to iterate with developers. At Uber, developer relations is just a signal. We don't have a standard developer platform in the way a lot of companies structure it, because oftentimes you have a BD team, a business development team that does top-tier partner integrations or partnerships, and those are very high-touch, high-leverage relationships that take a lot of work. And sometimes that means you don't get interesting. It's hard to come up with the tools for long-tail developers. And so what we wanted to do is just, if we open this up and make it easy for anyone to build on top of, what would they build? And so one of my favorite applications is actually bar roulette. And so this is not the sort of application that gets built with a business development team, because it's not going to create millions of dollars worth of revenue for Uber, but it's an interesting use case. And the idea is that I can pick a neighborhood in the city, I can add some friends, and then I can push a button and randomly choose a bar and get a ride there for my friends. And so this is one of the things we wanted to do, is iterate with developers. What use cases would they build for if we just allowed them to build anything? And so at a high level, we have the Uber developer platform and these 4 developer products. But let's talk a little bit about how we actually built this. And so I borrowed this slide from a talk on how Google does developer relations, and I think this is very similar to how Facebook and a few other companies do developer relations. And basically you have your platform team that does all the engineering, and then you have a developer relations team that sits in front of that works with the community and provides a feedback loop. And they help raise awareness of the developer products. They help take that feedback from the community and make the products actually even better. And they understand where common traps that people fall into when they get started, and how can you actually remove those to improve the experience. And so this doesn't work at Uber, partially because we have so many program teams and the way we're structured with programs and platforms. And so we have a structure that looks a little bit more like this. We have a platform team that's focused on infrastructure and operations. We have a features team that's actually building these developer products. We have an SDKs team that works on SDKs and sample apps to make the products very easy to integrate into third parties. And then we have partner engineering. So partner engineering works with our top tier partners like Facebook and Google, where they need a dedicated resource. And then we have developer relations. And so the developer advocacy team really focuses on the long tail developers. Anyone who shows up on the internet and wants to get started needs a way to get support. And so this is what happens at Uber and in general, and this only really works this might not be possible at other companies, but you need a place to bring people together. And so really this is how it actually is structured today. We have a platform team that does all the operational pieces. We have a features team that actually builds developer products. And then we have the SDKs team again that makes it easy for you to integrate with those products. And on top of that, we have partner engineering. And partner engineering's focus is really to work with top tier partners to make compelling experiences. But we didn't want this to just be top tier partners. Again, we want an open ecosystem. And so we really invested heavily in developer advocacy so that we had people to actually focus on the community. And so one of the things that we learned is, how do you support a large community like this? When I started in the open source world, it was before GitHub existed, and it was Subversion and Track, and before that was CVS. And in this world, once you open source something and it adds a lot of value to a community, people will just build features. They'll write documentation, they'll write test cases, and they'll contribute that back. GitHub made this even easier by just making it easy to submit a pull request. And so we really wanted a way to nurture something similar and to build our own community. We didn't want it just to be a showcase of integrations. We wanted it to be a community of people that support each other. And so developer advocacy is really focused on building a support community. Doing hackathons and events like this, and then driving innovation. So what are the APIs that people are asking for? What are the use cases that community wants to solve for that we haven't thought about already? And how can we enable them to solve those problems? And we really wanted to make every developer aware of the Uber API. So we go to events like this, and we talk a little bit about how we've built some of this stuff. And then we work with our partner engineers. And so partner engineers, again, they support the top tier partners. And they do it from idea to launch. It's a dedicated person that will work with them so they can go from ideation to launch. And they also influence the roadmap and the API design. What works for a long-tail developer might not necessarily work for Google's integration. And so what are those requirements, and what are the sort of the needs that we need to invest in? And then again, they support developer advocates by being the front line to the largest organizations in the world. And so they help us align the platform's direction with developer needs. And so the way the cycle works at Uber today looks a lot like this. Developer advocacy and partner engineering focus on what are the stability needs, what are the bug reports, do we have a major feature launching like being able to order Uber rides directly in Google Maps? And then what are the integration needs? What are the different APIs that are available? How should they be designed? What's the right level of data to provide? And then how do we actually provide a feedback loop from the community and to the features team? And so the SDKs team also provides integration needs. Does this make sense to have as a deep link? Should this be a REST API? Should this be an embeddable widget? What's the best way to expose this functionality? Sometimes you start thinking, okay, this should actually just be a REST API, and you realize later nobody wants to integrate with the API. They just want to be able to drop in the solution into their application. And so we really need to create that feedback loop. And then it's a two-way cycle. So the platform team really starts to work and understand developers' issues. Hey, we run into this error a lot. We're seeing a large spike in these types of errors. Hey, we're planning some maintenance and we're going to start doing failover testing. So we wanted to really focus on stability concerns and outage alerts. Like how do we notify the community so that we don't break their stuff? And the features team is really focused on long tail support. So how do we really figure out not just what our top tier partners want, but what's working for long tail developers? And so how do we start to solicit API feedback? And oftentimes they're the source of truth. Just because I think this is supposed to work this way doesn't mean that's how it was designed. Sometimes it's not really easy to understand whether it's a bug or a feature. And so the features team really helps us understand, okay, this is the intended use case. This is exactly how it's supposed to work. And then the SDKs team is very similar. They work with developer relations to make sure it's easy to integrate and that long tail developers get the support. All of these SDKs are built on GitHub. All of these problems flow through Stack Overflow or GitHub issues. And so we really want to be able to create a quick response. If you file an issue, you shouldn't have to wait a month to have it validated or not. If you submit a pull request to add some functionality, you really want it to get merged quickly. And so this hasn't always been possible. And the way we structure this makes that feedback loop very tight. And so the first thing you realize when you launch an API is you want to make it easy to adopt, and that means making tutorials and documentation easy to go from 0 to hero. If I know nothing about what your product does, I want to read one guide, and by the end of that guide, I want to have a solution to my problem. And so one of the things we focused on was these end-to-end tutorials. So if you go to developer.uber.com, anyone can sign up and just register a new application. Once you've registered a new application, you get a set of OAuth credentials and you can get started. You can add your developer team if you want to collaborate and share an application. And then it's easy to get started. But the other part about getting started is having partners understand the scope of work for a particular use case. A REST API integration is much more work than just deep linking into the Uber app. And so when you're making a product decision on whether you should do an integration or not, you really need to understand the scope of work you're agreeing to. And so we started to segment based on use cases and started to indicate the scope of work for each different use case. And I'll dive into this a little bit more, but we want it to be a good shepherd of your platform. It's really hard to repair people's broken trust. And if you see what some of the technology platforms that have gone out there, they've had to remove functionality. And you've seen this with companies like Twitter or Netflix, with Spotify, Venmo, where they've had to, at one point they exposed a bunch of interesting functionality, and then they had to remove it for one reason or another. And so we didn't want to make big breaking API changes. And again, we wanted to make it as easy as possible to integrate. So we offered single sign-on where you could just sign in with the Uber application using native SSO. We used deep links to make it very easy just to deep link into a ride. And then we created embeddable buttons so that you could just drop a button using an iOS or Android SDK into any application. And then finally, we wanted to include the entire Uber experience without actually having the Uber app installed. So we created an embeddable widget that made it easy to have the entire Uber experience. And so this is without having the Uber app installed. Into any third-party app, you can drop an embeddable widget that offers the entire Uber functionality from end to end. And so each one of these has a different scope of work associated with integrating with it. And so we wanted to make it easy for people to, one, integrate as quickly as possible, and two, get a real-time signal for how their integration's working. And so we started to launch self-service analytics. So what are the responses that I'm making? How many deep links and impressions am I getting? Like, how many people are actually taking rides through my integration? And so we wanted people to actually be able to get visibility and a signal on whether things are being successful as quickly as possible. I'm a developer. I've built documentation for many different sites, and what I realize is that API docs vary wildly. Like, API reference docs are not enough. And so we really wanted to make it as easy as possible to have an end-to-end tutorial. Again, we want you to be able to go from zero knowledge to having a successful integration through one tutorial. And so what we started to do is restructure all of our API products so that they're built around the functionality of the app. So whether you want to have a button and you want to embed that button on iOS or Android, whether you want to drop a widget on iOS or Android, you don't have to reference 10 or more docs to figure it out. You have one end-to-end tutorial. And then we started to break that down by language. And so one of the things that we started to do is, okay, for our REST API, we support Python through our SDK, Java, Objective-C, Swift, etc. How can I go from 0 to hero in a single guide? And so we restructured all of our docs based on this idea. And so it goes from literally registering your app to an actual working ride request integration, and you have it customized for each language. We always start with curl because that's the easiest to understand, just the raw HTTP request responses. And then we started to abstract with Python. Here's how you do this with our Python SDK. And so oftentimes there's custom steps that are required for different integrations. So on what works on iOS doesn't necessarily work with Android. And so we started to restructure this stuff. And so one of the things we wanted to do is that make it easy as possible to understand, here is the request that you need to make, and here are the potential responses. Everybody always documents the success use case. Here's how it's supposed to work when everything works well. But few people document the error use cases. And so what we wanted to do is to always show, whenever you make a request, here's all the different ways that we can potentially respond. And if we respond with an error, here's how you remedy that error. And so a good example is when you create a ride request, the default response is 202 accepted, you've created a ride and it's on its way. But then oftentimes for one user, there can only ever be one ride. Whether that happens through the Uber app natively or whether that happens through an API integration, you can run into different types of errors. And so again, for every time we document a request, we document all the different ways that you can run into all the relevant responses. And so I think this was a key learning that we had. Before, we had a lot of support around this 409 conflict, where a user's already on a trip, and then they try to make a request through a third-party app. And so one of the things we realized is that we should just make sure that all errors are very helpful and obvious. And then I think the basics are API docs. So every API doc should show you, okay, what's the endpoint? How do I make a request for it? What's an example? And what are all the different types of responses? And so we started to structure this for every different endpoint and make this easy to consume. And so SDKs and sample apps enable developers. I actually, whenever I get started with somebody else's platform, I don't really read the docs too much. I just try to find a relevant example on GitHub, and I download somebody else's app that they've already built, and then I dissect that, and that's how I figure out how to use tools. And so one of the things we wanted to build was as many SDKs as possible. But every time you launch support for a new SDK in a new language, there's a support burden that comes with that. There's ongoing maintenance and feature requests. And so you should support as many SDKs as you can and build as many sample apps, because that's far superior to any documentation. And what we learned over time is that for every SDK we added and for every sample app we created, we eliminated a lot of support requests because people had referenceable examples. And so my advice is to always build for as many languages as you can afford to. The nature of the real world means that it can be hard to test Uber integrations. All of Uber's users are transactional. You have riders, drivers, couriers, eaters. That means everyone who's actually on the Uber platform is paying for a service. And so this makes it really complicated to test. So what we wanted to do is make it safe to play in a developer sandbox. And so that you can simulate different products in different regions, different error scenarios where a rider or driver cancels. And so we really wanted to make this as easy as possible to test all the different use cases. And so if you want to launch a global integration, like something like offering Uber directly in Google Maps, you need to test for different products in every different location. And this can be very difficult. In the US, we have Uber Pool. Here we have UberX and Uber Pool. In Warsaw, we have Uber Pop, but Uber Pop doesn't have the concept of pool yet, where pool is where multiple people, we basically make it more efficient by offering more passengers in a car. And this leads to a whole nother level of complexity. How many actual seats do you need in a car? What happens if it's already full? Like, if you think about Uber Pool, it's really just a complex traveling salesman problem. And so you start to optimize these efficiencies. Once you start to do that, it's really hard to test this in different markets, because you have Uber Pool in one location, but you have Uber Pop in another. You have support for multiple riders in one location, but not in another. And in Warsaw, we have Uber Eats, and Krakow, we do not, right? And so if you're building these sort of global integrations, and if you think about the scale of Uber, this becomes quite challenging to test. And so one of the things we did was to launch the sandbox that makes it very easy to simulate any one of these conditions and to simulate Uber trips without actually having to pay for them. And one of the other things that we realized is just automate the tedious tasks. Like an hour of engineering allows you to be proactive instead of reactive to support requests. So we've changed the way our support cycle works. Instead of just responding to somebody's question, we figure out, like, what did we learn from this and how can we prevent the same sort of question in the future? And so that's really what we started to do, is automate the tedious tasks. And we did that in a variety of ways. One was to deep link generator. You would think just creating a URL is pretty straightforward. It's just it's a URL and it has a destination latitude and longitude and a pickup latitude longitude. You'd be surprised at how many support requests we get around this. And so what we did was just create a simple wizard on our website that will generate a native deep link or a universal link, and you simply type in a location and you're good to go. And so this prevented a ton of support requests, and so this is one of the ways that we automated. The next was really testing with personalized access tokens. When you first get started with an integration on most platforms, you have to do this OAuth dance, where you do an authorization code grant, the user approves this code, and then you exchange this code for a token. And just doing that step to get started is often a lot of work. So let's just make it easy to generate a token that has all the permissions you need to just run through tutorials. And so we made it easy to generate these and to embed them directly into our documentation. And again, errors should be obvious and useful. It's not just oftentimes when developers build an API and they throw in error, it's built for developers who understand that system. When you're building an open platform for a large community, you really want to document, okay, what is the error and how should I respond to this error? And so all of our errors actually tell you, here's the solution. In order to make this call, you need this API scope, make this request with this API scope, and then this will work. And so one of the things that you should do when you build APIs is make sure that all the API error responses are extremely useful for developers. And so again, the common use case for this was scopes. And so great support is critical. What we realized is that we wanted to build a community, and we wanted our community to live where the open source world already existed. And so that's on GitHub, that's on Stack Overflow and Medium. And so what we started to do is, instead of having private communities, just to work with the general public and on Stack Overflow. And so today, if you want to post support requests, you really just go to Stack Overflow and ask a question and tag it with Uber API. And so instead of having you create an Uber account and sign in and submit like a support issue that's private, we wanted to leverage what already exists. And so if you go to Google and you search for API errors, you often get sent to a Stack Overflow page. So we wanted to build on top of that. Oftentimes there are certain private requests or more sensitive requests where people really just want to be able to send an email and have a private conversation. So we enabled a private Google group that people could build on top of and just start to email with. And then we wanted to promote on Medium and not have our private blog, so we started to adopt in sort of standard tools from the community. And so all this is built on open source tools, and we contribute a lot of this stuff back on GitHub. So if you go to uber.github.io, you can see a ton of the open source tools we've built, including all of our SDKs and sample apps. And it's not only the code that we share, but it's also engineering knowledge, so how we built this various systems. So this isn't a technical talk today, but there's a lot more in-depth technical talks on our engineering blog. And so we wanted to share what we learned as well. And so part of what we learned is what works for a single API doesn't work for a developer platform. When we originally launched Ride Request API, it was relatively straightforward to have a pretty simple use case. People want to just go as a person from one location to another, and they wanted to make an API call to do that. And so as we started to launch the deliveries API and the drivers API, and we started to offer webhooks to build trip experiences, we realized that this doesn't work for a single team. When you have hundreds of internal program teams who want to expose new functionality and new APIs, we wanted to make it self-service. And so using this model where we just have a single developer advocacy team and partner engineering team didn't work well. And so we changed it up a bit. And so what we tried to do was scale each one of these pieces independently. And so a lot of the way the structure works today is we have our platform team that's focused on core infrastructure and engineering, and then we have our features and SDK team. And so we collapsed it all, and we really said, okay, what we really want to build are developer products, right? It's not just APIs, it's actually a releasable product to a market, and that's a product launch, etc. And so we have our platform team, our developer products team, our developer advocacy team. And then for every program team that wants to build on top of Uber's API, what we start to do is dedicate resources so that they can actually build with top-tier partners. And so with the driver API, we added dedicated partner engineering so that they could do integrations with people like Intuit and H&R Block. With our deliveries API, we also added partner integrations so we could integrate with some of the top tier on-demand delivery services. And so we started to change this. And one of the things we had to understand was how to scale our process into our team. Early on, whenever we released an API, it was an engineer working with another engineer all the way through the process, from idea to launch. And sometimes what we had to realize is we don't want to be involved. We don't want to be blocking every time. This cultural value of let builders build really means to not block other engineers. And so oftentimes what we had to do was change the process so that third-party teams could just build without having to involve us. And so one of the other things we realized, developer value comes from listening to your developers. You have to build the things that people want. And so just because we think there's a cool idea and we release it, doesn't mean it's going to work in all the markets. So be receptive to that feedback and iterate on your products. It's pretty straightforward, but oftentimes this goes unknown. And so one of the other pieces, company value really comes from discovering what your developer platform uniquely provides to your company. It's not just enough to have an API to do third-party integrations through a business development team. One of the things we learned through this process was simply that we need to empower these internal teams to actually launch their own APIs. Our value was not simply in rider acquisition for our business development team, but it was also about driving engagement and building better Uber experiences through new developer products. And so this took a little bit of time to understand we're not just an extension of business development and a way to do integrations, we're actually much more. But ultimately the challenge is not technology, it's imagination. And so what future will you build? You can find out more at developers.uber.com. You can see all of our docs and easily get started. And that is all I have. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. Thank you very much.